Hey everyone, I'm back again for another review, and this time I'm going to be tackling two very different films this time around. So let's not waste too much time now, and let's get started. First movie I'm going to be talking about today is The Northman. The Northman was certainly one of my most anticipated movies of 2022 for sure. Definitely up there as most anticipated non-sequel or franchise-based film of the year due to this film being the third film from Robert Eggers. If you don't know who that is, he is director of both The Witch and The Lighthouse. And both of those films I think are absolutely fantastic, with The Lighthouse being possibly one of my all-time favorite horror films in recent memory. So, I'm already hooked based on that sentiment alone. Though, when you add in him doing a Viking epic, then you got something that sounds really worthwhile as a film. It seems like this was going to be a much grander spectacle than anything else Eggers has done prior. While I don't think this movie is quite as good as his previous efforts, The Northman is still a very unique epic that's just as brutal and big as you would like from a film like this, but it's also very odd and peculiar. All in a good way, mind you. The story is basically a retelling of Hamlet, the basic old kingdom tale where a young prince has to avenge his father's death after being struck down by a jealous family member, and after years of not seeing his family since then. So compared to Eggers' previous work, this film has more of a straightforward narrative that does feel quite familiar at its core, yet it still manages to work quite well for a number of different reasons. As while it's straightforward, this movie doesn't waste its time on much else. It has a clear focus on the main lead in this film, and doesn't feel the need to detract with any major subplots or filler. For being close to 2.5 hours, time never really feels like it's wasted here. Plus, while the story is familiar with it being a retelling of Hamlet, what they do to update it makes it more refreshing, not just in terms of the setting that gives this a very gritty version of Viking lore, but also in regards to how it handles its characters that we usually see in this kind of story. Without spoiling too much, we get a lot of neat changes to the Hamlet tale that does still make this a rather compelling narrative that is often ballsy with its storytelling. It's a very brutal and violent movie that's definitely going to detour a lot of casual movie audiences. Though that doesn't mean that it's not done with some craftsmanship and care. This is definitely Eggers' biggest film from a production standpoint. And fortunately, it pays off pretty well here. This movie does look incredible. The production design is excellent, creating the authentic feel of that time period, and the cinematography is oftentimes breathtaking, with so many long takes that make you feel like you're a part of this world. All of this is paced really well to where you don't feel like this world is overstaying its welcome, and it gives you that great sense of Norse mythology this film is based around. To see it unfold in such a big spectacle of a film, while still retaining a lot of Eggers' marks as a director, is fantastic to see. The only real downside is sometimes it can get a little CGI heavy, and it's not the greatest admittedly, but it's not a big killer for this film. As far as characters though, the entire cast does a very fine job here. They're not the deepest in terms of characters, as they are made to fit the archetypes for this kind of story. Yet all the performances are quite good, and they bring variation to some of these tropes. Really the only downside is that, like most movies, this could have benefited by having more Willem Dafoe. Despite all of that though, I do highly recommend The Northman. It might be not quite as strong as Eggers' previous work, but this director has clearly brought a neat sense of style and directing, and I'm glad that he's given the opportunity to do something as bold and big like this. I wouldn't quite recommend this to everyone. If you're not into super weird or violent films, this might not be for you. However, if you're willing to take a risk and check out something pretty cool that's also very well done, I think The Northman will suit your expectations pretty well. So take that for what it's worth. And I'm gonna give The Northman a 9 out of 10. The other major film I saw recently was The Bad Guys. As far as DreamWorks Animation goes, I definitely consider myself a fan of theirs, despite them not always making the best movies. They can definitely be a hit or miss studio, but The Bad Guys was looking like it would potentially be more on the hit side of their movies. It seemed to be going a different direction than most DreamWorks movies, being more of a crime heist film with talking animals, and a really unique art direction that emphasizes more on style than realism. Naturally, I got pretty interested in seeing what this project was going to do for DreamWorks as an animation company, and fortunately, this film ended up being a lot of fun. The Bad Guys, of course, centers on this team of animal criminals that everyone's afraid and threatened by, until a situation occurs to where they want to change their ways and be seen more as heroes, and thus begins the journey of them hopefully winning over the city that once saw them as a threat. With a premise like this, you can kind of see where this film is ultimately going, especially one that's geared towards younger audiences. It's the typical sort of animated film that's about redemption and has some twists and turns, but nothing too surprising. However, that doesn't mean this isn't really good or original, as the execution of this movie really makes it feel a lot more refreshing. This film is a crime movie at its core, but it doesn't feel too ridiculously kiddie about it either, and instead plays it off more like a satire of crime films due to a lot of cleverly written jokes and visual gags poking fun at some of these tropes these films have. It almost at a point feels like what would happen if Tarantino directed a kids film, with how dialogue focused it can be with its characters. I mean, the film opens very similarly to something like Pulp Fiction, where it's two characters having a very entertaining conversation at a diner. It creates a pretty chill vibe in the mix of all the crazy action set pieces that go on throughout the film, which the animation definitely deserves a shout out for being another DreamWorks movie that does something different. It's possibly the most stylistic and cartoonish DreamWorks has gone for, with a lot of 2D animated elements appearing constantly throughout the film. Not really focus on realism this time, but that's totally okay, as the director even stated that this cartoony aesthetic was 100% intentional. And luckily, it pays off very well due to all the colors and expressions that pop out instantly in every frame of this movie. Props to the animators for not being afraid to be very creative with this film. As for the cast of characters being focused on here, this is a really likable gang of misfits that all have their unique traits to one another that benefit their team being the ultimate band of crooks out there. The animation really helps them be as expressive along with the voice acting, as all the actors playing them fit pretty well and all deliver their lines in a very quick and funny manner. They're a great cast of characters that I love seeing, although if I had to critique a little bit, most of them don't really get that much development. Really, the only two that we mainly get a focus on and see most of a character arc is for both Wolf and Snake. I ultimately really like where both of these characters' stories ended up going, and both of their arcs really add to the redemption theme here, with Wolf being the one that's a little bit more suave and charming, and Snake being more of the bitter one between the two. Though the other side characters are mostly there for the hijinks they get into, and we don't really get to know them as much. That's not to say I don't like any of these characters, because I do. I like the crazy piranha, who apparently can also sing well. Awkwafina's style of humor and performance fits much better here than her performance in Raya as far as animated films go. And I love how this movie is almost like the Suicide Squad if they used King Shark from the Harley Quinn animated series instead. They're all fun characters, and I really enjoyed this journey with them. The Bad Guys is not the most groundbreaking film from DreamWorks Animation, but they clearly were aiming for something with a lot of style and fun to it. For what it is, I definitely recommend checking out The Bad Guys if you're into animated films of any sort. It's a very clever, funny movie that manages to take familiar elements and put them into a neat, stylized animated film, making it feel more refreshing than you would initially think. So take that for what it's worth. And I'm gonna give The Bad Guys an 8 out of 10. Both of these movies are pretty good. I definitely recommend checking out both of them when you get the chance. And I'll see you guys again next time. Later.
Bad guys become the good guys so we can stay the bad guys. You know what I'm saying?
It's fantastic! Wolf, you're a genius!